Welcome to the Capstone Conversation, where you learn about what's happening in the greater East Bay. I am your host, Jared Asch. Welcome to today's episode of the Capstone Conversation. I am your host, Jared Asch. Today, we are going to dive into an important topic on human trafficking. What does that mean, and how does it impact individuals? This episode is for everybody. If you're an elected official, a nonprofit leader, a business leader, on a board of something in our communities, this is impacting all of us. And when I heard some of these people speak several months ago, I knew I had to have them on the podcast because it was scary how relevant this is to all of us and what goes on under our eyes. Today, we're going to have a panel of three awesome women to talk. We're talking to Katrina Natal from the Contra Costa District Attorney's Office. We're talking to Amy Schumann from Arm of Care and Erica Veni from Freedom Insight. Did I get everybody's name right? Katrina, why don't you start and give us a little bit about your background and then help us to define what human trafficking is, and then we'll dive into Amy and Erica and their nonprofits.
Okay, sure. Thank you. My background, I actually serve at dual capacity. I sit here at the District Attorney's Office, but I also direct the county's anti-human trafficking task force called the Contra Costa Human Trafficking Task Force. I came to this work. I had a long career. I've trained as a human rights lawyer, worked for many years abroad on gender-based violence and mass atrocity, and have always had an interest in these issues and these topics. Excited to be able to bring some of that experience to this work. I also, very long time ago, worked in direct services, primarily for survivors of sexual assault and child sexual abuse in an era before the TVPA, not to date myself. In terms of what human trafficking is, I think in its most basic level, we're talking about someone who's being forced, coerced, or through fraud or other similar means being made to work. And that work can be anything. If you're talking about sex trafficking, it's sex or sex acts for money. If you're talking about labor trafficking, it can be any kind of work. It can be housework, childcare or elder care, construction, restaurant work, farm work, beauty services. Really, the key component here is that someone is
being made to work. And it does not require physical violence. It can be more psychological or emotional in the case of threats or duress or coercion.
And it does not require physical violence. It can be more psychological or emotional in the case of threats or duress or coercion.
That's pretty clear and concise. Amy, do you want to introduce yourself and talk further about the organization?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I'm grateful for Arm of Care to be part of the county's efforts that Katrina heads up. Arm of Care was founded about 13 years ago in the Bay Area because the FBI called the Bay Area one of the highest density areas in the country for exploitation of children. And because of my background, I'm a recreational therapist and a movement therapist, and have done so much trauma training and healing work around helping people with trauma. I've been doing this work for 40 years with traumatized populations. And we took our creative arts perspective and trauma-informed expressive arts therapy and ways of recreating joy in somebody's life to change the patterns of how trauma has impacted a nervous system. And we use ARM stands for art, recreation, and movement. And we use those creative arts to restore and empower not just the youth, but women and men who have been commercially sexually exploited. And those at risk for exploitation. We work in domestic violence shelters. We worked at juvenile hall in Contra Costa and Alameda counties. We're working with populations that are often very vulnerable to being.
I got to ask, are we still at the top of the FBI's list as a big area here for this problem?
Yes, and Katrina can speak to that also. But yes, the Bay Area is considered, I think they go between 1 and 3 in the nation. And I'm here in Georgia. Georgia goes between 10 and 13 in the nation in the Atlanta area because of the transportation from the airports. I think it's vacillates depending upon how many issues are reported and that sort of thing. And reporting is definitely an issue.
Erica?
I'm really happy to be here. I've actually been working in the counter trafficking space for close to 18 years now, I want to say. Most of my work has been global. Initially, I was serving as executive director of a group called Lotus Outreach International, and we were combating human trafficking that was happening along the Thai-Cambodia border, including sex trafficking and trafficking for labor of vulnerable migrants. I pivoted into general international development work for a few years after that, and then recently was working with NORC at the University of Chicago. And I led several prevalence studies all over the world for the U.S. State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. I also worked with the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, Freedom Fund, and International Justice Mission to lead prevalence studies on forced labor, child sex trafficking, and online sexual exploitation of children, as well as child domestic servitude. Joining Freedom Insight, which I just did not so long ago, I'm coming on 2 months now, it's been a breath of fresh air. It's really a return to the practitioner side of the anti-trafficking movement. And I am a native Californian. I've spent my whole life here, including 2 stints in the Bay Area. It's really refreshing to be able to address this issue in my own backyard. And here where I live in San Diego, we're also one of the worst regions in the US. I think we have about 8,000 victims of trafficking per year in our county alone. Freedom Insight is formerly the Bay Area Anti-Trafficking Coalition, or BAATC. And it was really focused in its early days on being the connective tissue of the various anti-trafficking groups that were established across the Bay Area writ large. And we led a Freedom Summit, which was one of the largest gatherings of anti-trafficking advocates in the world at the time. And we also helped establish many of the trafficking task forces that I'm sure we'll talk about today. We've since become pivoted to a national nonprofit and are now doing trainings of frontline workers, specifically in the hospitality and transport sectors, to recognize and report the signs of trafficking. And we're working with airport partners in 9 states to do just that, including having partnered at various points with all 3 of our international airports in the Bay Area.
Wow. Let's dive into this a little bit more before we talk about programs and everything. Let's talk through, how does this impact us in our communities? Where is this occurring? Because we're talking like the number 1 region, right? I'm becoming aware how prevalent it is, but it's not something that I per se notice every day. But is it really going on here?
Sure, I can jump in on this, Jared. Yes, absolutely. It's happening here. We see it in Contra Costa County, throughout the county. There's not any community that's not impacted by this. And it shows up in a lot of different ways. With regard to commercial sex work and sex trafficking, we're really talking about a lot of that has gone online. And where it's happening can be in hotels, motels, cars, other similar kind of locations. Sometimes they're residential brothels, some massage establishments are engaged in sex trafficking. The labor side of things, really can happen in any business or commercial setting, right? It's not just agricultural farm work or individuals you might see that are selling fruits or other things by the roadside. It can happen in restaurants. It can happen in expensive, nice restaurants. It can happen in care facilities. Really, the possibilities are endless. What we know is that where there are folks that are vulnerable, which there are vulnerable people everywhere in our society, and someone with the inclination to exploit them, that's where human trafficking can happen. It happens everywhere, or it can happen anywhere. And also, it can happen to anyone. As I said, I think vulnerability is a big part of how that happens. But I think sometimes we get the idea that this is only happening to folks that maybe have immigrated to our country, or folks that may be on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. But actually what we see is that this can happen to a wide variety of folks.
I would love to just give like a really practical example, and you could hear from Katrina's response how broad and prevalent the issue is, which is why Erica's organization does education in the transportation space and hotels and things like that, because it's everywhere. I have an experience where I was walking downtown Walnut Creek There was a young girl who looked a little disheveled. It was a crowded morning. It was a Saturday morning. She got out of a car, and I watched a man walk somewhere into a coffee shop, and she was waiting outside for him. And I saw her and I asked her if she knew where she was. And she named a different city other than Walnut Creek. I said, how did she get there? She named the person. I asked her if she had ID or a phone. She didn't have either, which are telltale signs. Polaris Project is a national hotline organization. And even on their website, they will have ways that the average citizen can just identify. And then you can call the Polaris Project number. I ended up calling that number, and I called the Walnut Creek Police Department. I stood behind a restaurant. I waited till she went back with him. I asked her if she wanted to come with me and walk to the police station, or she did not. And I stood behind a restaurant, gave the license plate, called the police, and reported it. I don't know what happened, but it's better to report something than to not report something. But here's a disheveled looking young woman. She was probably 20. And the questions you ask her, they have a list at Polaris Project, some of the questions that you ask. And the man look just like a normal, he looked like he was just a normal businessman, dressed nicely with her.
Thanks for noticing that. And I think that's a great example of how it is on our streets in every community. Erica, do you want to build on what the other two have said?
No, I would just say that we do know that there's around 1.1 million victims of trafficking in the United States. That's an estimate. It's a very difficult thing to measure. But trafficking happens where people are. And of course, the Bay Area is massive. It's about 20% of California's population. And it's a $1 trillion plus economy. If it were a country, the Bay Area, larger metropolitan area, would be one of the 20 largest countries in the world. It's a massive space in terms of people, transport, and money. And where those things happen, trafficking also happens.
And Jared, if I can add
Yeah.
one, just build off of something that Amy said. I think sometimes we go out and we do outreach. It's not uncommon for folks to express the view that this must be the kind of thing that happens in less affluent communities or places where there's a highly concentrated population, that sort of thing. And there is an element of the concentration of population, but I really just want to emphasize that in Contra Costa County, we're seeing it happen in every community. And if you think about what Erica just mentioned, which is how lucrative trafficking is as a business model, you can understand that an affluent community where there are people that can pay, for example, for commercial sex, for folks that are being trafficked, then it makes sense that it would be there, right? Because it's just a simple supply and demand kind of issue. I think there's also a bit of a perception in Contra Costa County that this is the kind of thing that happens in Richmond, because Richmond has an area in the city where there is street level commercial sex work and trafficking happening. But that's sort of one small segment of trafficking that happens in the context in which trafficking happens. And it doesn't mean that because it's a little bit more visible in Richmond, that therefore that's the place where it's really a problem and nobody else has to worry about it. It is really throughout the county.
And I imagine it's the same in every city then throughout the Bay Area. In the case of a restaurant, as an example, does the owner of that restaurant, like he hires these workers, are they in on this? Is there an organization that's just by ignorance on the issue? Does his head chef who does it, do they have these people on the side as laborers? Who's involved?
I would say in many cases, a trafficker doesn't realize that they're a trafficker. Especially in the case of labor exploitation, it might be the employer, and the employer is engaging in practices to take advantage of the worker and to control their movement and communication, withholding wages from them, maybe even controlling their identity documents. And they're doing this as a way to control the person, but they don't realize that they are a human trafficker. It's not a clean sort of villain scenario. In the case of sex trafficking, there doesn't have to be a third party in the case when a minor is involved. Any person under the age of 18 that's engaged in commercial sex is automatically considered a victim of human trafficking under the TVPA. That means that there doesn't really have to be a third party that's involved. It can just be the simple act, a commercial sex act that's taking place, and the buyer may not know that person is under 18. Oftentimes in online sex ads and so forth, they will advertise the person as being an adult when they may not be. There's a lot of unknown trafficking that's happening, not just unknown from us in our communities, but also the traffickers themselves may not be aware and the victims may not be aware. But it's a very complex issue.
If I can add to that, Jared, I think that another thing, what Erica has said about the TVPA, which is federal law, is also true under California law. If you're a minor who is engaged in commercial sex work, this is not child prostitution. There is no such thing as child prostitution. This is human trafficking. And you don't, as she said, you don't have to have a third party involved. Also, I would say within what we have seen in the county in terms, and I want to be transparent about this, labor trafficking is still very much nascent in terms of its identification and certainly in terms of holding folks accountable for labor trafficking. I think most counties throughout the state have worked on very few of these cases. It's been investigated from a law enforcement perspective and prosecuted even fewer. We're still figuring out how to do that. But I think in most contexts, we're talking about what Erica described, and that's certainly been true in our experience in Contra Costa County, is that there's an employer who is employing folks directly and in the labor trafficking context and is at a minimum not complying with labor law in California, maybe not paying minimum wage, not allowing breaks, those sort of things. That would be just straight up labor exploitation. When you start to add those elements of force, fraud, coercion, and similar means, that's where you start crossing the boundary from labor exploitation and labor code violations into labor trafficking or human trafficking. That's things like controlling movements, restricting where a person lives, holding on to identity documents, making threats against them or family members, that kind of thing. That's how that transition happens. And I could imagine there might be a scenario if you were in a larger context, like maybe a hotel, motel, restaurant scenario, where they're using outside employment agencies to bring folks in for staffing, where the actual employer may not be aware of the experience that the workers are having. But so far, we haven't seen that. That doesn't mean that it's not happening or it's not possible in this county.
If I may
So-
piggyback,
please.
Jared, on both Eric and Katrina, what they shared is an organization in the Bay Area called Not for Sale. And the founder of that organization, I may get these facts a little bit incorrect, but try to listen to the general idea of it, was I think it's about 15 years ago, he was eating at a restaurant in Berkeley. He uncovered one of the first trafficking rings in the Bay Area. The restaurant had to close down. All of the employees were underpaid. He realized they didn't have any ID. They were living upstairs in the restaurant. And those are the kind of stories that were happening years ago that we were uncovering to discover what was really happening in the Bay Area. And I'm believing Not for Sale is still active in the San Francisco area. I think the founder is an ethics professor, and he would even have his students do lookouts for sex trafficking rings in the San Francisco area, where they would do stings at night to see people coming in and out of like massage parlors and things like that.
I want to build on that. If I'm going to a restaurant, as an example, as an individual, my wife and I are on a date, or we hire a contractor to redo our landscaping, we're hiring what we believe is a reputable, licensed, insured firm. What are signs we should be looking for, and how can we help? I don't know who wants to take that first. Erica?
Yeah, I think sometimes the signs may not be so outwardly visible. I think maybe if it clears that their movement and communication is being controlled, I think could be a potentially big sign for someone like coming onto your property. If they express that they want to leave their job, but they're too afraid to. If they owe money to the employer recruiter, it's a form of debt bondage. Maybe they pay to get the job up front and then they're working off that debt. And then I mentioned before that they don't have control over their identity documents. So it may not be very obvious to you as the consumer, but when people do see things, they have several methods and approaches for reporting. And one thing we usually advise people to do is not to try and directly intervene, because that can lead to harm for potentially yourself as well as the victim. The first thing is, if you see someone and it's clear that they're in immediate danger, or you witness a crime actually happening, obviously call 911. That's the fastest response. I understand that there is a trafficking tip line for Contra Costa County, and you could correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's 925-957-8658. People that see things within Contra Costa County could call that tip line, and there will be a local response happen very quickly. And then finally, we do have a National Human Trafficking Hotline, which has already been mentioned. And that number is 888-373-7888. We actually suggest that everybody actually puts that number in their phone so they have it when they need to call it, because no one's going to remember it. But that hotline will do a number of things, including deploying law enforcement, and they'll help triage the situation and even connect, if it's a victim, the victim to service providers that can help them, even bypassing law enforcement, if that's what the victim or survivor prefers. Feel free to jump in, anyone else.
Katrina from the task force, I know you've got a lot in here.
Yeah, for sure. We definitely recommend. One thing I would add on indicators, and I agree with what Erica said, which is that oftentimes one of the challenges with trafficking is that it's not easy to identify by members of the general public. But I would add one other thing to the list, which is if you notice that it appears that folks are living on the premises of where they work, that can be another indicator. And then in terms of response, we really encourage folks to, obviously, if it's an emergency situation, reach out to 911. If it's not, but they want to make a report, reaching out to their local police department non-emergency number. And then, of course, the human trafficking hotline. Erica gave the number, but it's 925-957-8658. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't say human trafficking tip line. That is a voicemail. They would leave a voice message. They'd get a return call the following business day. It's not for emergencies. I want to make that clear to folks. If you've got an emergency, you need to call 911 or call your local police department. But yeah, we would follow up with folks. If folks aren't getting the response they anticipated, maybe they called one of those other resources and nobody responded, then definitely call the tip line. We will do follow-up. We work closely with all of the local law enforcement agencies and all of the direct service providers working on human trafficking in the county, and we will get them connected. And we understand that not everybody wants to make a report to law enforcement. Also, they can call community violence solutions if they're looking for resources or services as a survivor of human trafficking. And that number is 1-800-670-7273. Again, it's 1-800-670-7273. And they are a 24-hour, 365-day-a-year crisis line. And so they have a human trafficking team and a program. They will respond. They can go out if someone is at a hospital or another location, as long as it's a safe location where they can meet them, they will go out and meet with them in person and get them connected to services.
And let's continue to build on this. I'm a father of 3 daughters. 11, 8, and 6. What as a parent should we know? Because we think we're raising our kids right. But what I'm hearing is this affects everybody, not just lower income. This is a middle class, good neighborhood in theory. What are signs we should be looking for, not just my daughters, but for everybody in school? How do we help avoid these in the future? What do we teach? Amy, you want to?
But I think educating your children about safe people and who's good to be around, who isn't good to be around, what's good touch, what's not good touch, having trusted adults in their life that they can go to and say things, letting them, honoring their intuition. If they are around somebody and they don't feel good around them, let them not feel good around them and walk away and explain why they don't feel good around them. But just giving them the power and the permission to help them discern what is healthy to be around and what isn't healthy to be around. Like teaching your children about good relationships. There's lots of books out there for children at different age levels, educating them about this issue. There are mandates in different states. I know California has it. I know Georgia has it as well. And Aaron's Law and different SBs and ABs asking for education regarding human trafficking and sexual abuse in the schools where the kids are educated. And You can always check with your school and ask if the kid's school, is there any curriculum addressing these mandates for the law, that the children will get information about that. And then keeping a guard on their online activities too. A lot of kids are recruited online. We have one who just was recruited recently in Pleasanton. I met with the mother when I was out in California 2 weeks ago, and she was groomed online, and in a little different scenario, she was given diamonds and thousands of dollars worth of clothes, and he lived in Beverly Hills in a 7,000 square foot home and was part of the mafia, and then she just got transported by private investigator family service with her dad to another state. There was a rescue intervention and it was successful. I think it's just teaching your children that everyone's not safe and helping them identify who is safe in their world. And also being able to see signs when their peers, when their friends come to school. That's part of the curriculum to be carried out in the schools, is helping to identify, so came to school and she doesn't talk as much and she doesn't look at me. And I talk to her and she's wearing new clothes and she has an extra phone. Being able to help the kids even identify signs for their peer group. I hope
Okay,
that's
Erica?
There are actually some really good resources that have been made for parents who want to make sure their kids are safe. The first thing I would say is that luckily many school districts do have a curriculum that they cover, I think, usually probably when kids are entering junior high school and into high school. But there are really good resources online. One is available at love146.org/caregivers. There's just some general tips and guidelines on how to recognize risk among your children, how to educate them on cyber safety, as Amy mentioned. And we encourage all parents to find one resource to walk through and become familiar with how to address the issue with their children.
And I would add to that, Jared, that within the county, we do have several partner organizations in the task force that are doing education in the schools, both at the junior high and senior high school levels. And that can be, sometimes the mandate really only requires more of a short-term training, but they also have programs, specifically one that uses the curriculum from Love 146 that Erica mentioned, that is a longer-term multi-week series of meetings that students engage with, that's really targeted at reaching both young people that may be at risk for human trafficking, as well as students that are interested in being an anti-human trafficking advocate in their schools. I think that's happening, and that is really important. Other things I would say are being engaged with your kids, paying attention, trying to establish the kind of relationship where kids are able and willing to share. And if it's not you, another trusted adult, being available for that. Knowing who your kids are hanging out with and spending time with, knowing what they're doing online. All of these things are things that are covered in the resources that Erica mentioned. But I think it's really that being really aware and really engaging with your kids on this topic, understanding how they're spending their time, which I know can be incredibly challenging, particularly in the era of social media. But nonetheless, I think that those are important tools.
Everybody give one piece of social media online advice in a sentence or two that's clear cut, that parents and teens should know.
Mine is ask your children to not form relationships with people they don't know online.
Erica?
I guess I would just say, maybe especially as they're very young and not able to have good judgment about who they're interacting with, I think just having really tight parental controls over their online behavior would be important as they're becoming more familiar with how to use technology responsibly.
And Katrina?
I would say two things. One, have a thorough understanding of what information is available and to whom when you're using an app. I think there's a lot of assumptions about privacy that aren't really accurate. And then the second thing I would say is, if your child wants to get on a particular app, vet those apps online. It's pretty easy to type in an app and learn more about what it is and how it's being used. And I wish I could remember off the top of my head, I cannot remember, but just the other day, we came across an app related to an ongoing investigation. None of us had ever heard of it. And the first thing that popped up when you Googled it was how it's being used for, there's a lot of human trafficking activity happening on that app. That goes apps, especially if you're not familiar with it.
Yeah. I want to talk to Erica about hotels. How I met all three of these organizations was Visit Walnut Creek, and Nicole Hankton, a shout out to her for raising awareness to this topic, hosted a meeting with all of the hotels in Walnut Creek on this. Talk to us about the hotel industry, their role, and some of the education you do for those organizations.
The hotel industry is heavily intertwined with commercial sex trafficking. I think I read a statistic that somewhere around 80% of sex trafficking cases will move through hotels or motels at some point. And there are any number of employees in hotels that are well positioned to recognize the signs of trafficking and make reports to either law enforcement or through a human trafficking hotline. That includes the front desk people, but also the cleaning staff. One example of something they might observe would be if there's, say, a girl in a room and they're changing the sheets multiple times a day, that kind of thing. There are trainings available. I think and we offer more general trainings, and they're specifically targeted to front desk people in hotels. But there are trainings available that are more targeted for different people within the hotel sector that can recognize trafficking. But we do know that it's a very effective way to identify and intervene in trafficking. A lot of reports do come from hospitality sector workers.
One thing I heard there is of people who are in sex trafficking or being sex trafficked, 80% of them will touch a hotel or motel at some point. What does that look like in terms of numbers? And maybe Katrina, you could help bring that back to the Bay Area. What are some numbers that are going on here that make us number one? What's the impact in our communities here?
Sure. I don't think it's always challenging, right? We don't have prevalence numbers for how much human trafficking is happening in hotels and motels in California, other than to say it anecdotally, it reflects that statistic that Erica mentioned. What I will say is that any given day, you can go up. There are tools that law enforcement use that track ads for commercial sex work. And in any given day by 9 o'clock in the morning, there will be hundreds, if not over 1,000 ads posted in Contra Costa County for that kind of activity. Now, not all of that is necessarily human trafficking. Let's keep that in mind, right? Because it is possible for someone to be engaged in commercial sex work and not be trafficked. That is, I think, far less common, but it is still possible. We're talking huge numbers. I think probably if you did an anonymous survey of hotels and motels in the county, every single one of them would probably say they have had issues with sex trafficking at their facility. It's just the nature of what happens. I think what's really important is to try to reduce, I think, the stigma that hotels and motels sometimes feel and really change the culture around it. Admitting that's happening is a positive thing to do because it means that you can take action to try to prevent it and respond to it when it's happening. If you're opposed to even acknowledging that problem, that can be really challenging. Partially in response to that, the state of California, the legislature, created legislation under Civil Code 52.6, which requires hotels and motels and a number of other businesses to post posters giving information about what human trafficking is and how to connect to resources. It's almost an infinite supply of scenarios that could be investigated, and routinely law enforcement agencies will work with hotels and motels to try to address human trafficking issues and try to get services to survivors and investigate potential traffickers. The other thing that I would say about this is that it's really important to get good information from hotels and motels, something that the task force is working on. And we're going to have a convening in January, on January 22nd, specifically for hotels, motels, and small businesses. And this is in partnership with Freedom Insights and Arm & Care as well, and the Visit Walnut Creek. It's going to be focused on this issue and what those hotels and motels and small businesses can do. Because calling in a report is great, but also the kind of information that you're able to give when you call in that report is really going to be determinative in terms of what kind of action law enforcement might be able to take, and also determinative in terms of getting that potential survivors connected to services. It's not only noticing it, but it's then what do you do with that information and what information are you gathering? Because when you're running a hotel or motel, you actually have access to a lot of information because you're taking all kinds of information when you're booking those rooms and you're on site, just as Erica said, and you've got people seeing kind of the comings and goings and that kind of thing. We're really honing in on those industries and how we can collaborate more closely to make sure that we're responding to this human trafficking that is happening.
Out of nail salons, restaurants, contractors, what kind of numbers are we seeing in there? How many places are maybe engaging? I know there's no pure numbers, but give us an idea.
I think some contexts are more well understood than others. And I think that's because in some contexts, it's easier to identify than in others. But we could take the context of massage establishments. There is a website where you can go if you're interested in finding a massage establishment that offers sexual services. And you can go and you can search there by location. And we routinely find ads for probably throughout the entire county. It would be at least 100, maybe multiple hundreds of establishments that advertise those kind of services. It doesn't mean that they're not doing other massage that doesn't involve that, but that is a part of their business model. And then oftentimes what we find is that there are elements there that are potentially human trafficking, meaning that this is not work that the folks there are voluntarily engaging in, but there are factors like debt bondage that are keeping them engaged in that work. That's a concrete example. I think we've had multiple cases related to restaurants. We've had multiple cases in the county related to situations of caregiving or domestic work in the home, which technical language describing domestic servitude, all of those different industries. But numbers are just really hard to come by, and also they can be a bit inaccurate in the sense that they make it look like it's a smaller number. If you base yourself just on the number of cases investigated by law enforcement, you are absolutely underestimating, because there are a lot of challenges for a case to actually get to the point of being investigated. And even if you base your numbers on victims or survivors that are engaging with service providers, you're also going to get an underestimation, because we know that not everybody reaches out or even knows that there are resources available to them. That said, there is more than enough to keep all of the law enforcement agencies in the county busy working on these cases. It's not a question of, are there cases, particularly in the sex trafficking realm? It's a question of how many of those can be thoroughly investigated, given the resources available to law enforcement.
Why don't one at a time you take us out with final thoughts on the issue, on what you want people to know, on CARE, on your organizations, and how to find more information. Maybe we'll go Erica, Amy, Katrina.
I would probably just reiterate things I've already said. It's really important to just know the signs, what to look for both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And being familiar with that, also have the National Human Trafficking Hotline number programmed into your phone so that you're ready to make that call, regardless of where you are. And you're ready to make it on the spot, because trafficking appears and disappears very quickly in many instances. That would be the main thing that I would say that people can do. Any American can do that right now. And we will, I think, on the blog post some language, hopefully, about recognizing the signs of trafficking. There are some really good and simplified resources available, even pocket cards that people can print and keep in their wallet.
Thank you. Amy?
Yeah, I'm going to go underneath the issue a little bit in my response because of the work we do, right? We're at the restorative end of the process, and we're also at the prevention end. And basically, it's a buzzword we use in our culture, and it's self-care. And if I'm taking care of myself and I value myself and I have hobbies and things that help me process hard things in my life and that rejuvenate me and make me feel better, and I'm around good people, then the assumption is that I'm going to be more apt to make a better decision. I'm going to be more apt to be more in touch with something that doesn't feel good to me and something that does feel good to me. And my suggestion as a population in the culture is to have things, and it sounds very trite, but it's documented and scientifically proven that if I have creative ways and to express myself and to process through pain and difficulties and to enjoy my life, I'm less likely to get into hard situations. I can possibly identify situations quicker. This is not to put any blame on somebody who's being trafficked, but what we're doing is we're reinstituting ways of self-care for those who have been trafficked, and we want the people who would be vulnerable to be trafficked to attend to their vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that makes sense, Katrina.
Yeah, I think that I would, as a overarching message from what we've talked about today, I would really want to emphasize for folks that as much as in our culture and the media, human trafficking is represented as this really sensational, rare, other thing that happens other places, it involves white vans and kidnapping and all of that kind of stuff. But this is really actually a very local, very in our community issue, that it's an everyday thing. And just because we don't see it doesn't mean that it's not there. I think if people put themselves in that mindset and reflect on some of the things that we've talked about in terms of how it might show up in our communities, they will also start to recognize that, oh, okay, that counts as human trafficking. The other thing I would say is if folks want to get engaged and get involved, the county does have a human trafficking coalition, which any member of the public can participate in. It's a separate body from the task force, but it's intended to be a place where folks that are interested in this issue can learn more and engage, or also consider volunteering with one of the many organizations that will share with you, Jared, and can be put in the blog post. If you're really feeling like this is something you want to engage with and you want to make a difference, then think about where you might be able to contribute, whether that's volunteering, whether that's financial support, whatever that is. That's the more people that are engaged, the more success we're going to have in trying to end human trafficking.
Thank you all for the work you do in our communities. Katrina, I assume through every county in the Bay Area has a task force similar, or because people don't stop at a county border. Most people
No,
don't even know where the
absolutely.
county
No, it's
border
for
is.
sure the trafficking is in every county, but different counties operate differently and have different resources. There are obviously California, big state. There are lots of usually county level task forces throughout the state, but not every county has them. And sometimes the way that things are configured can look different. Some counties have coalitions and task forces. Some have just task forces. Some have just coalitions. But yes, usually there should be in most counties, particularly counties in the Bay Area, every county should have some sort of body that's working on this issue. And what that looks like can vary, but folks can Google and figure out what that is at their particular county.
Thank you all for being here and sharing this really important issue and discussing it. I'll follow up with you and let you know when it comes out, but thank you. I feel like I have to go hug my girls.
Go hug your girl.
Yeah. Trafficking things do anytime.
Yeah, for sure. And thank
All
you
right.
for
Thanks so much for having us, Jared.
absolutely, and good to see you all.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Likewise. Bye.
Thank you,
bye-bye.
everybody. Wait, don't leave yet. Hit subscribe. Make sure you get the weekly updates. We have a new episode every Wednesday for stuff happening in the East Bay. In the meantime, follow me on LinkedIn, Jared Asch, or check out our firm where we have a weekly newsletter and blog at Capstone Government Affairs on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us today on the Capstone Conversation.